So I'm going to talk about the FreeSurfer processing pipeline that I use to process my data for laminar fMRI experiments. So this is in a way off-label use of FreeSurfer. FreeSurfer is meant to work on the 3D 1mm data, and it works great out of the box. But for processing the sub-millimeter resolution 7 Tesla data, we had to make a whole bunch of modifications and tweaks to actually get the results that we wanted. So just at the beginning, I wanted to say that I'm making certain assumptions. So I assume that we're using this for single subject analysis and for sub-millimeter resolution 7 Tesla data. And other people had roadmaps. I'm a simple person. I have an outline. So we're going to start with anatomical data processing for surface reconstruction. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the acquisition, just because it's been mentioned here already that there are different types of acquisition used for this anatomical reference data. And I'm actually using multi-echo MPRH. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. Then we're going to talk about the bias field correction and also tissue segmentation. Finally, we're going to talk more about the surface reconstruction with FreeSurfer or ReconAll, and about modifications that we have to make for dealing with this high-resolution data, and certain edits for the segmentation of both white matter and the brain mask. And finally, we're going to talk about creating a family of surfaces across cortical depth. And then we're going to switch to the functional data processing to measure these laminar activations. I'm going to very quickly talk a little bit about the pre-processing of the data. I think a lot have been said about it already. I'm going to talk more about the registration of functional data to anatomical data, and then projection of volume data onto the surfaces. So basically projection of the fMRI data, but also derived z-statistic maps and such, anything that has been calculated in the fMRI volume data. And finally, I'm going to show you our anatomically informed smoothing method. And we're going to finish with the overview of the scripts, which we'll be using tomorrow if you decide to learn a little bit more about this pipeline. Now at the bottom of the slide, we have just two of many references to the original work by Bruce Fischel and Anders Dale that basically put this foundation for the FreeSurfer. So there's a lot of literature on pretty much any tool, any method that is part of FreeSurfer. These two are the most relevant for the surface reconstruction. So with that, let's start with the anatomical data. So let's start with the acquisition. As I mentioned, we use MPRH, which is magnetization prepared T1 weighted acquisition, and we like it for a strong tissue contrast that it provides, and also for the fact that we can get the high resolution data in a reasonable imaging time. That means about 7-ish minutes. And we use a multi-echo variation of the sequence, so you can see here 4 different echoes. And this multi-echo MPRH sequence actually helps us with at least partially mitigating the problem of dura, so basically suppressing dura. Dura and inclusion of it in the brain mask can be a problem and can cause misplacement of the PL surface. So you will see in a few next slides that it actually can cause a lot of issues. We combine these images with the root mean squared approach to increase SNR. And one problem that we have to deal with this MPRH images is air field inhomogeneity at 7D. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about it on the next slide, but one way to help to mitigate this problem on the acquisition stage is to use these fancier pulses as the foci pulse mentioned here, which is optimized to minimize effects of both B0 and the transmit field inhomogeneities. So that's what we use. And since this question already came up here, this last reference on the slide is actually a paper that compares MP2 range with the multi-echo MP range, specifically for surface reconstruction with FreeSurfer. So anyone who is interested in learning a little bit more about that, I highly recommend reading this paper. So let's talk more about this field inhomogeneity at 70. It's the result of the dielectric properties of tissue, sort of inherent to the tissue, and it can also be affected by transmit coil design and geometry. And it results in spatially varying transmit efficiency and spatially varying flip angles, which would affect excitation pulses. And that results in our images in a bias field, smoothly varying intensity bias, as well as degraded tissue contrast in these high inhomogeneity regions. And that can be a huge challenge for the segmentation, as you will see in the next few slides, and in consequence for surface reconstruction. Now, the conventional correction approaches, including the one that is used in FreeSurfer, are not really complex enough for this 7 Tesla bias fields. They fit low-order spatial trends, and they're just not enough to deal with these biases. So what we use instead, before we pass the data to FreeSurfer, we apply SPM joint estimation of bias and tissue segmentation. And this is the example how it works. This is our data before correction. You can see pretty substantial bias fields. And this is after correction. But it is not that easy. So with this approach of the bias field correction and segmentation with SPM, we have certain trade-offs between mitigating the bias and in the same time preserving tissue contrast. So basically, if there is some intensity difference in the image, it can be interpreted either as a different tissues next to each other or as a bias and can be removed. So there are 2 important parameters to consider for this 70 data processing. Bias regularization, which is really answering the question how much we should penalize large variations in the bias field, and bias smoothness parameter. And here is a beautiful image showing how setting of this parameter to 4 different combinations works. This image and a few images coming up were provided to me by Daniel Gomez, who is a postdoc with John Polimany, and he's been working on these issues for quite some time, trying to optimize this pipeline the best for our 70 data. So coming back to these images, you can see at the bottom row are the images with the smoothness of 60. I believe this is the lowest smoothness that we have available through the graphical interface of the SPM. So if you want to go lower, you have to actually use the scripts, which is what I use. And you can see that these 2 images don't look particularly good. I would not want to do surface reconstruction on them. The top row looks better. And specifically, this parameter combination turned out to be the best for our data. Now, it's important to get it right because it will affect the surface placement. Here you can see a couple of different surfaces that were generated from differently corrected for bias data. Unfortunately, I don't know which one is which one, but you can see that even within this parameter range, the differences are pretty visible. And now, this is the combination of parameters that works for our data. And Daniel actually found this really interesting line in SPM manual that says knowing what works best should be a matter of empirical exploration. So if you get a slightly different data using slightly different acquisition with slightly different tissue contrast, you'll have to go back to the drawing board and try a bunch of parameter sets, see what works best for you. The good news is that it doesn't really take that long. So it's a little bit labor consuming, but it's totally doable to actually do that. And as a byproduct of the SPM bias field correction, we also get the tissue segmentation maps for 5 different tissue classes. So for gray matter, white matter, CSF, and also there's 2 extra tissues that are basically outside of the brain, soft tissue, and you can see here the probability values. There is a certain range to this map, and bone. And these 2 I'm going to actually get back to in a few slides, as they can be helpful for correction of the segmentations of the brain from FreeSurfer. All of this is generated with the Gaussian mixture model with at least 1 Gaussian per tissue to represent the intensity distribution of tissue class. And as I said, they can be helpful as an alternative source of segmentation to deal with certain issues of the segmentation that FreeSurfer provides. Okay, so with this, I would like to actually get to talk about the FreeSurfer. So this is going to be like a 3-slide crash course on FreeSurfer or Recon All, which is part of the FreeSurfer. For people who actually used it before, it's probably just going to be boring. For people who haven't heard of it, it's probably not going to be enough information. So I'm going to point to different sources where you can actually find more about different aspects or different sub parts of this surface reconstruction. So Recon All is essentially like a big script which underneath calls a lot of different commands that do a lot of different things. And there are 2 streams in this reconstruction: volume-based stream and surface-based stream. And volume-based stream comes first. So the whole thing starts with intensity correction and normalization of the input volume. So we end up with this T1 MGZ volume file. MGZ is a native format of FreeSurfer. It's kind of similar to Nifty. There's a MRI convert tool and probably a bunch of others, and they're super straightforward to use to convert between the 2. All of these volume outputs of Recon All will live in the subdirectory of our directory called MRI. So Recon All creates this specific directory structure within the directory that you give it as an output. And it's always going to be the same. So once you learn it, it's easy to identify where the files might be. It's easy to locate the files. The next step is skull stripping or brain segmentation, and we end up having this brain mask MGZ file. Automatic subcortical labeling based on Atlas. We're not going to talk about this much today. And finally, white matter segmentation or inside cortex mask. This is basically a segmentation of everything that's inside the cortex, so white matter, ventricles, and such. And this is an important volume because it's a volume that is used for the transition from the volume to surface-based stream. So, surface-based stream works separately on left and right hemisphere, and it starts from this white matter segmentation volume that I showed in the previous slide by covering it with triangles. That's called tessellation to create the mesh. So this is an example output surface or mesh. Surface on the left, on the right you can see you can see vertices. It's more like the mesh representation of it. And this surface is very rough, very jagged. As you can see here in this little zoom in, it kind of looks messy. So the surface-based stream, the first thing that it does is actually refining the surface. So it adjusts the placement of the surface, the placement of vertices, with certain smoothness constraints, following T1 intensity gradient. to eventually create white surface. And this is our white matter, gray matter border surface. This and all the other surfaces will live in the subdirectory surf, by the way. And in the next step, this surface is expanded, again following T1 intensity gradients until we get to the PL surface. So these are the two main surfaces outlining the cortical rebound. You can see them here overlaid on the volume. And this PL surface is also inflated, this time with no intensity constraints, but with distortion constraints, to create this inflated surface, which is a really useful construct for visualization of the results, and we'll see it a lot in the next few slides. And finally, this surface can also be inflated further to a sphere. And sphere is useful because we can actually see topological errors of our surfaces inflated the sphere much better. We can correct them and then deflate back. So this is the kind of process that FreeSurfer Recon All does under the hood. It can also be used for spherical registration across subjects. As you can imagine, you can basically inflate two different subjects to a sphere, and then the registration becomes somewhat easier. But we're not going to talk about that today. And what's important to mention, and I'll probably mention a few times during this talk, is that we have the same number of vertices and we have vertex correspondence across all the surfaces. So white matter, PL surface, also inflated surface or sphere, they all have corresponding vertices in any location that you look. And now I just wanted to quickly introduce the concept of surface overlay. It's basically a data file where we have a value assigned to each vertex of the surface. And there are two very useful overlays that FreeSurfer generates for us. It's cortical thickness map, where we have a distance, as you can see on this little zoomed in thing, distance calculated between white matter and PL surface. And we can overlay it on the inflated surface, as you can see here, have values from 0 to 3. And similarly, we have cortical curvature overlay. You can see again it's calculated at each vertex with this circle tangent method. And again, we can overlay it on the inflated surface to actually visualize, to see how it changes over different cortical locations. And this overlay concept is important because all of our MRI data, fMRI data, or any kind of volume data that we'll be projecting on the surfaces, they'll end up being overlays. So it's just kind of something that I wanted to highlight here, and we'll definitely talk more about it in the upcoming slides. All right, so now I wanted to quickly talk about the FreeView. FreeView is the viewer that is part of FreeSurfer package, which can help you view volumes, surfaces, and overlays, and a bunch of different things on top of that. You can, obviously it has a graphical interface because it's the viewer, but you can run it from the command line. As a simple version like this, would just load a volume to a FreeView. You can also load surfaces, including some parameters of the surfaces, like you can specify edge color, as well as we can load overlays. They always have a corresponding surface on which they're being overlaid. And they can also have a lot of different parameters. In general, FreeView is great. You can set up the commands for future use that you basically just copy paste with a whole bunch of different parameters, how this data will be displayed for you. You can even make it do automatic screenshots for you while you are away from your computer. It's a really great tool once you figure out how to use these crucial parameters. And the best place to start is the help command that will display all this potential flags and parameters for you. So I highly recommend playing with that. And here we have a video which hopefully will show a little bit more about how to use FreeView. So we run freeview from the command line. We are now opening a volume, just input FreeSurfer volume. And you can see there are 4 different views here, the 3 planes and also the 3D view. You can choose how you want them arranged. And you can also open surfaces here. So we first open a PL surface for right hemisphere. And we can change the color of the outline of the surface. We can also look at the 3D. I don't like the slices, so I remove them. And you can rotate them, switch to the view where there's only a 3D, so you can see it better. Now we're gonna load the inflated surface, so I can show you how to use the overlays. So this is the inflated left hemisphere, and I'll switch it to this gray version, which I like more. We can switch off the visibility of other things that we have loaded. And finally, this is where we load overlays. So it's not the most intuitive place. And I'm gonna just show you the cortical thickness overlay. So it has to be, of course, for the same hemisphere. So we can use the surface mesh for the representation. And you can see it's projected on the inflated surface. We can also change the color map and the thresholds here to window it better so it can actually be more clear. And with that, I wanted just to talk a little bit more about some other outcomes of the recon all that can also be useful. So there is a directory with labels. These are atlas-based labels, but they're subject-specific. They're in this surface framework. So if you're interested in a specific region of the brain, this is the place to look for them. I mostly use V1 label from them all, so I don't have a lot of experience, but there's a lot of stuff there that is definitely interesting. There's also a directory with scripts, which basically includes all the log files. There's a record of all the commands that were run. There's a record of all the outputs of this command. So if you run recon all, go away for 6 hours or whatever it takes on your setup to run, and something crashes, this is the place to look, find the last command that was run, see what went wrong. You can even find the dump of all the environment variables that were set at the time of running these commands. So it's a really great place to start debugging if you have any issues, or just learning what the recon all was doing under the hood while you were not watching. Now, to learn more about FreeSurfer in general, there's an excellent wiki page with pretty much anything and everything you may ever want to know about FreeSurfer. There's also a mailing list with many experts, so if you have any more specific questions, there are over 100 commands in FreeSurfer, and they're under active development, so there's a lot of questions that will arise that might be just specific to what you're trying to do, and there will be someone, I'm sure, on this mailing list who will be able to answer these questions. So this is definitely a good place to look for help. There's, of course, a sub-page of this wiki for recon all. And there's one page that I personally really like and I find it very helpful. It's this table for recon all that basically lists all the commands that I run in recon all with the inputs and outputs and parameters, and also it lists in this flag column a label or flag that you could pass to recon all to just run this part of the script. So normally you would run recon all with the all flag, and that is going to run the whole set of the commands. But if you want to run a specific part because either you're debugging something or you just generated different segmentation, like we'll see in a few slides, and you don't want to replace this segmentation again by rerunning the segmentation part of the FreeSurfer, This is a way to sort of run Recon step by step. You can also skip some steps if this is something that you either don't need or you have replaced different strategy for that part. That's also possible. And there's obviously a page for Freeview, as you can see, and there's also a page, part of the tutorial about troubleshooting the data, and there's a couple of different sections there. I'm going to talk about the two that we found very helpful for our high-resolution data processing. So there are two potential issues that we are dealing with, kind of fundamental. Misplacement of the peel surface and misplacement of the white surface. And they're usually a result of inaccurate brain or white matter segmentation. So I'm going to talk about these two issues now in a bit more details and try to show you how we can try to address them for our specific cases of the high resolution data. So let's start with the brain segmentation, which in Recon is performed with the MRI watershed command. I'll again use some work of Daniel Gomez here. So the problem that we are trying to address is that we have a brain mask that includes either dura or sagittal sinus, and that can lead to misplacement of the peel surface. So if this is our mask, the result of the MRI watershed run with the default FreeSurfer parameters, you can see there's a bit of a problem here. It extends outside of the brain, and that's just not good. So what we can do as a first attempt, we can try to change some parameters of the watershed. For example, the H parameter, which defines the height of pre-flooding of the watershed. And you can see that this mask has improved on the back of the head especially. You can see that it's now much more accurate and much more corresponds to the actual brain. But it's not that easy. So we can see that improved on the back of the head, but if we look at the entire brain, there are places where the brain is now quite significantly eaten. So the bottom line is we can fix it for one location, but we may not be able to fix it for the whole brain, and that may actually throw off the surface placement altogether once you pass this brain mask to the FreeSurfer, to the Recon All, and you actually ask it to place surfaces for you. So we still have a problem. This is another example from my own data. We have a brain mask here. You can see already that it includes a whole bunch of stuff that shouldn't be there. Especially here in the visual cortex, when I'm interested, the region that I'm interested in, you can see that there is a quite significant piece of the sagittal sinus included in the mask and also included in the peel surface. So that's a problem. So one approach that we tried, and it sometimes works, not in this specific case, but I'm going to show you how it could work, was to actually use this bone and soft tissue segmentation from SPM that we looked at a few slides ago and create a no-brain mask. So this is a mask that you can then subtract from our brain mask. And this is how it would look like here. And you can see that it doesn't really help in this particular region. Now, these maps from SPM are probability maps, so we can threshold them as we wish. Perhaps making a little bit more aggressive no-brain mask would be helpful here. But more likely than not, it would be the similar result like in the previous slide, that you would basically fix it in some regions and ruin it in some other regions. So our last resort approach is to correct it manually. So what we do here, you can see it better on the zoomed in piece of the brain. We actually limit our mask to this yellow mask, as you can see. And this is a version for the whole brain. And then we can rerun the part of Recon that runs after this mask was created, so we're trying not to override it. And these blue lines show you the surfaces after this intervention. So maybe they're not perfect, but they're way, way better. And here is the video from the FreeSurfer wiki page showing you how it can be done in the Freeview. So they're doing it in this recon correction mode. You can also use the mode right next to it, which is basically drawing of the brain mode. But essentially what you want to do is just 0 parts of the mask. It's a pretty brute force approach, but it works. You're gonna do it slice by slice. My recommendation would be, whenever you're doing it, to at least have a view open, or at least check it in all 3 different planes. So you can either do it sort of as you go, or you can look later in 3 different planes to make sure that it doesn't look too much as a soul pattern. But this is basically practical demonstration how you can do this. Okay, so let's move on to the white matter segmentation now. That's performed in Recon-All with MRI segment command. And here our problem is that very often we have white matter masks that include some gray matter, and that would lead to misplacement of the white surface. So here's a nice example from Daniel again, showing a result of the MRI segment run with the default parameters. And you can see a problem. So again, we can start from just using different parameters for MRI segment to improve this situation. And here is an example with different thresholds for gray matter and white matter. And you can see that it does look a little better, not quite great either, but there is some improvement. But obviously it's not this easy. So here's another beautiful figure from Daniel, which shows you how mean intensity of the gray matter varies across the cortex. So you can pretty much see just from this image, but also from these histograms here, that if we set a global threshold for upper or lower gray or white matter, it's going to work okay-ish for the whole brain, but it's not really going to be working great in any specific region. So you can see on these histograms, the blue one is the whole gray matter, and the orange one is just calcarine. And the red is a threshold that we're using for gray matter. So you can see that it will work very differently on these 2 histograms. So again, we have to move to our last resort approach. So we'll take this piece of a brain again. This is our problem region, and you can see the current white matter segmentation is sort of supporting this white surface going in the wrong direction. And again, we'll do correction to something like this and run the subsequent parts of Recon-All, and you can see the yellow surface is now matching much better. And again, here is a video from the FreeSurfer website. Now in this video, they actually have an opposite problem. They have a hole in the white matter segmentation, and they don't want to have it. So they're just filling it manually, again in this recon edit mode. So yeah, a little bit bigger brush, so it's more efficient. And let's go over all the slices. So this is again a practical demonstration of how you would do this. And finally, a couple of perhaps the most important modifications to how you run Recon-All for sub-millimeter resolution data. And this is the high-res stream that has been developed by Natalia, cited below, who worked with John a few years ago. And these are the changes, as I said, that are specific to sub-millimeter resolution data. So first, every time we are using sub-millimeter data, we want to use high-res flag. And that will stop FreeSurfer from something that it apparently does as a first thing during the Recon-All processing, which is downsampling the data to 1 millimeter, because this is what FreeSurfer expects and this is what it works on. So if your data is higher resolution than 1 millimeter, you definitely want to use this flag. And another important change is to use this expert file, and it's basically a text file where you can specify some additional parameters. And what we want to use here is MRI-S inflate of 100. So this parameter is normally 10. And we want to change it because when we're dealing with this high resolution data, we are producing surface meshes which have higher vertex density. So that will require more iterations for inflation of the surface sufficiently that can be projected to a sphere for this fixing of these topological defects that we mentioned earlier. And if you don't do it, I don't have this images right now, but I can definitely pull some for tomorrow. You have this wiggles on the PL surface. It looks pretty bad. So you kind of want to make sure that you inflate it enough. So if you see the wiggles, that means you may want to try to increase this parameter. And finally, I want to talk about the creating surfaces between the PL and white surface. And for that, we're going to use MRI's expand command to create evenly spaced surface meshes. So we have this white matter and PL surface, as you can see here, and we're creating the intermediate surfaces. Basically, usually we go for 9, but you can use any number you want here. And you can do it in different ways. We usually just use it as a percent of the cortical thickness. And we like 9 because that creates nice 10 beams across the cortex. And here is a zoomed in version of it, so you can appreciate a nice color gradient from white to PL. And an important thing to mention here, or highlight it again, I think I mentioned it before, is that there's a topological correspondence between the surface meshes. So each vertex will have a brother in the corresponding location on the next surface, and that works across all of them. And with that, we're gonna now move to the functional data processing. As I said, I'm gonna go over the pre-processing pretty fast. There has been a lot of things said about some parts of pre-processing today, so I'm just gonna quickly remind you a couple of key points. So we are dealing with the 4D fMRI data both on input and output here. And the whole purpose of this process is to ensure that our data meets certain assumptions that we make during the analysis. So, for example, we assume that the time course comes from the same anatomical location across the run. And to assure that, we apply motion correction. We can also apply slice timing correction to ensure that a voxel in any given time frame will be sampled from the same instance. We can apply B0 distortion correction to correct for distortion effects. Again, make sure that there is a spatial consistency of the data. And finally, we can apply smoothing, and we'll talk about the smoothing quite a bit more in a few slides. Now, the things to keep in mind is that there may or may not be a correct order how to perform the steps, and also that each one of them can introduce interpolation. So perhaps it will be a good idea to sort of combine them together and interpolate just once. It's just something to keep in mind when you're preparing the data for further processing and analysis. All right, so let's talk about the registration. Now, this and a couple more following slides have some figures that Doug Grieve kindly lent me. He's an author of this method that we're using that is called BB register, as it stands for boundary-based registration. So this registration uses boundary-based cost function, which is applied to the white matter gray matter border, which is our white surface. I'm not gonna go into details here, but you can kind of see on this figure that we have this white surface and we're just moving it to match the intensity contrast between the two tissues. So this is like a very high level and general idea behind what this method does. Now, before it's based on local tissue contrast, it's actually robust to any slowly varying bias fields, which is a good news. In general, it's an inter-subject registration method, but cross-modal. So we use 6 degrees of freedom, rigid body. That's pretty much all a subject can do with the head during the scan, as long as it's still the same head. And this method is also specifically working well for aligning partial volumes to the whole brain, which is a great news for us because many times in our laminar fMRI, pushing for high resolution would limit the field of view, and we just scan the slab covering just the region that we're actually interested in. So this method can be very helpful to align this data correctly and provide us with the correct level of accuracy that also is very important for the laminar fMRI. And there are a few tricks that you can do with BB Register that I wanted to show you, that I often do. So first of all, you can pass to BB Register an initial registration transformation, which can be created with anything, but I like to just make it manually. So I literally spent 1 minute per brain. As you'll see, this movie is about 1 minute long. And I open in the TK register viewer where I can have fMRI, anatomical data, and also the white surface. And I just add a couple of shifts or rotations just to align this fMRI volume sort of okay with the anatomical data. It by no means should be perfect. The algorithm will do its job. It's just to give it a good starting point so it's not completely lost, especially if your run was farther away in time from acquiring structural data. There is a high likelihood that the subject have moved slightly. So it's a good idea to just make sure that we start from like a sensible location. So I check it in all 3 planes and save this file and then pass it as a parameter, as you can see, to BB Register. Another thing that we can do in BB Register is to help with our distortion problem. So Bezier distortion, it's incompatible with the rigid body model. You have the stretches and the nonlinear stuff going on, and so it has a high potential to ruin our registration. So a simple thing that we can do, and that I actually use most of the times, is to use EPI mask parameter or flag. And that makes BB Register use FreeSurfer labels to ignore both edges of the brain, but also the regions that are known to have high Bezier distortion. So this can be very helpful as the alignment won't be affected by these regions. But I just recently learned that there's also another way of doing that I also wasn't aware of, or maybe it's just a new feature. You can pass a voxel shift map to BB Register. So you can generate this voxel shift map, for example, from the B0 map acquired separately. And that should make BB Register actually include the distortion correction in the registration process. So that sounds like great news. I'm not sure how well it works because I haven't tried it yet, but I definitely am going to. And the best part about it is that what the BB Register will do, it will actually shift or distort the surface to match fMRI volume, not the other way around. So we won't be doing any interpolation and resampling here. So just to point it out, we are actually creating the transformation files here. We are not registering the fMRI volumes per se, so we're not interpolating or resampling the data. But what we do, we create these transformation files that can be then used to project our data onto surfaces. And now a little bit more about that. So this is done with the MRI vol2surf command. And we are using a surface-based approach here, which is somewhat different than the voxel-based approach like Ranzos Laney uses. So just to explain what I mean, we are not really assigning a depth to each voxel. We are assigning voxels to the surfaces. So in a way, voxels to depth. And this way we're creating the surface overlays that we mentioned earlier. So if this is our cortex with the PL surface, white matter surface, and this intermediate surfaces that we generated earlier, this is our voxel grid. And you can see this blue voxel is going to be projected onto these two surfaces. And this is a great method for visualization of the tangential activation patterns as a function of cortical depth, as you'll see also in a couple of slides in some examples. Thanks to this topological correspondence of the meshes, it's actually easy to generate depth profiles in every location at every vertex. They are still going to only cross as many voxels as the cortex had in that location, but we can pretty much pick the location at any given vertex of the surface. What is not good about this method is that the voxels are getting counted multiple times. So unlike in the volume-based approach that each voxel gets unique depth and is counted once, here each voxel gets projected on multiple surfaces. And as we push for higher and higher resolution of our data, we may also find ourselves in the situation where we have the mesh that is so sparse that we actually miss some of the voxels. That can be, of course, fixed by upsampling the surfaces, but it's just something to watch out for. And here is how the projection of the data on the surfaces actually looks like. So this is an overlay on the white matter surface. This is actual fMRI data. It's just weird color map, but these are actual fMRI data values. And the mid depth of 20%, 40%, 60%, 80%, and finally 100%, so that's a PL surface. And as I mentioned, what we are doing here, we're creating these transformations that can be used to convert any volume data that are in the same space that are sort of co-registered with the fMRI data to the surfaces. So if we have labels that we have manually created in the volume space, if we have statistical maps, as you will see in a few slides, we can use the same transformation to project this data onto the surfaces. So now I would like to switch to my favorite topic, which is smoothing. And conventional fMRI studies often use smoothing, and they do it to increase SNR and so increase detection sensitivity, to remove across-subject variability in multi-subject studies, but also to potentially remove false positives because activation is assumed to be smooth. But the kernels, the 3D convolutional Gaussian kernels that are usually applied, they can smooth an average over a lot of things. So as you can see here on this little cortex cartoon, this is actually 1.1 millimeter data, and the kernel is not really that large. It's about 5 millimeters, and you can see that it smooths across voxels that are actually distant on the surface, that belong to opposite banks of the sulcus, that belong to different tissue types, like it's mixing in CSF, and it can potentially belong to different functional areas depending where we are in the brain. So that could introduce activation mislocalization, biasing it away from the site of neuronal activity. So we applied smoothing to reduce errors, but we might be actually introducing more errors. And in order to deal with this problem, surface-based approaches to smoothing have been proposed that basically restrict smoothing to the cortical ribbon. So they treat cortex as a 2D ribbon and just smooth within it following the cortical folds. This cited examples here are just two, but there's more. And so what we proposed a few years ago was to take it a step further, and instead of treating a cortex as a 2D ribbon, start looking at the cortex as it is a 3D structure. And this is now available in FreeSurfer as this command with a very catchy name, MRI's Smooth Intracortical. You'll have an opportunity to practice it tomorrow if you're interested. And the background is that we decided that since we have the sub-millimeter voxels, as I said, we can look at the cortex as a 3D structure. So this is our cortex. And we can take the small voxels and redistribute them the way that they will avoid signals originating from CSF and white matter. So if these are the big boxes are big voxels, the small boxes are small voxels, that's kind of obvious. So we can take whatever would normally fall into one big voxel and would be sort of average with the same weight, and redistribute that and create the kernel, which not only will have a shape that we desire, but also we can introduce weights and we can modify the contribution of different small voxels to this kernel. So we propose this to use this family of surface meshes that we've been talking about to create these steerable kernels that will track the folds of the cortex, but will be also flexible in terms of their tangential and radial extent, so we can parameterize that. So you can have these stick kernels, we can have pancake kernels, and we can have this intracortical kernels. And first, what we were just trying to do really was not necessarily laminar fMRI application, but just trying to find a kernel that will be the best compromise for avoiding the noise that comes from mixing in CSF and activation dilution coming from the white matter where we do not expect to see activation. And it turned out this is our best kernel. We call it no white matter, no PL. And just quickly, basically what we did, we acquired some resting state and some breath hold data, and we compared these intracortical kernels to volume-based smoothing of equivalent smoothing capacity, but also to the matched 3 millimeter resolution data. And what we found was that the TSNR for our no PL, no white matter kernel was higher than the volume-based smoothing, which we kind of expected, but it was also higher than TSNR of the original low resolution data, which is kind of surprising. Similarly, tissue specificity measured as FCNR was also higher than both of the other cases. So we concluded that this no PL, no white matter kernel produces the best balance between high TSNR and FCNR. And surprisingly, it actually might be better to acquire high-resolution data and appropriately smooth them than acquire low-resolution data. But what does it mean for our laminar fMRI? So if you have any prior information about the spatial structure of the activation pattern, such as laminar or columnar activation, we can utilize that and design the kernel that would match our expected activation shape. And we could use this kernel, for example, to create ROI from the separate run of the functional data, like a localizer scan. We could also apply them to our data or results, like the statistic maps, for the visualization. You can also apply them to the actual data. You should always be careful, though, and minimally look into, but ideally also show in your paper to the reviewers both the raw data and the smooth data, just because there is always a risk that we may introduce the activation that is not there. So it's just good to keep that in mind and be somewhat cautious about it. All right, so let's finally get to what we've been waiting for this entire talk, which is laminar level activations in the cortex. So how do we do GLM? How do we do our statistical analysis in this whole framework? So the easiest way to do it is actually to do it in the volume space with any given approach that you like. I like to use feet from FSL, and then project these results on the surfaces. So this is an outcome of feet for one run. This was a visual task, so there is some activation there. It seems to be in the correct place. It seems to be well matched to our paradigm, at least in this one example of voxel. So what we can do, we can project this z-statistic onto our inflated surfaces. So this is actually activation in, or z-statistic in mid-depth, but it's projected on the inflated surface, taking advantage of this topological correspondence. So this looks okay, but it looks even better if we average over 10 runs. And again, we can project it on the surfaces. And here is the version with a little bit of tangential smoothing, not too much, just neighborhood 1, so it's pretty subtle. All right, so that was it in terms of the background. Now I'm just gonna quickly show you what we'll be doing tomorrow, if you choose to learn a little bit more about the FreeSurfer approach. So I prepared this pipeline script. It's a shell script which contains most of the commands that we've been talking about and that you can test tomorrow. There are 3 different tags there. To-do tags means that you should make sure that the path or the file name is provided, and it actually refers to your file structure or to the location of the FreeSurfer on our server. So that's just providing sort of the input information. Long is a tag that I use to mark the commands that will run potentially for several hours, depending on how good of the machines we're working on. So you may want to just leave them for later, because you're definitely not going to see the results within our time frame that we have. And check are the commands that I marked that are loading the results of the previous step or steps for the sanity check, for the quality check or quality control, to make sure that we know what's going on with our data and it's not like a black box, the whole thing we're doing. I already provided you with the recon outcome because, as I said, it will be very difficult to wait for it. And I already provided you with the bias corrected data as well. I also provided a couple of scripts for like motion correction, detrending, averaging over multiple runs, the statistics, and a couple of other things, but we can talk about it more tomorrow when we'll be actually working on it. And with that, I would like to wrap up just showing you very quickly, since we are kind of running out of time. This is just a movie from the work that we've done a few years ago, showing the evolution of the response to retinotopic stimulus across cortical depth. So it's a selected time point, and the movie is basically going from white matter to the pillow surface, and we can really nicely use this surface-based approach to look at the change of this activation on this kind of way. And with that, I would like to thank you and also John Polymany, who is my mentor, Bruce Fischel, also my mentor, and together with Doug, they created and contributed a lot to the FreeSurfer, to the different tools in FreeSurfer. And both Doug and Daniel provided me a whole bunch of figures and slides, so thank you for that as well. And also, if you know anyone who is looking for the postdoctoral position, I'm actually hiring.